Welcome, system thinkers. You're watching The Question. I'm your host, Ben Callahan, and each week I invite a new co-host to join us and help facilitate a deep dive into design systems. This episode of The Question is sponsored by Zeroheight and Sparkbox, and we're so glad you're here. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to join me for this episode's deep dive. My name is Ben Callahan. I'm a design system researcher, writer, speaker, coach, and consultant. But most of all, I'm a curious guy. And that's precisely what led me to create The Question. Every week, a new co-host and I will ask you a few questions about a very specific design system-related topic. You'll have 48 hours to answer, and everyone who does is invited to join the deep dive. Each week is like a mini research project on a very niche design system topic. And this only works if we all stay in learning mode. Before I introduce my co-host for this week, I just want to say a big thank you to Zeroheight and Sparkbox for sponsoring this episode. Zeroheight is the end-to-end design system management platform, the place your team can document, deliver, measure, and evolve your design system. Book a demo or learn more at zeroheight.com. Sparkbox partners with complex organizations to create user-driven digital experiences, including world-class design systems. Learn more at sparkbox.com/thequestion. This week, we're talking about the controversial topic of how to start your design system, from the inside out or from the outside in. I am super excited. This is episode 2 of The Question, or as we call the actual conversation piece is the answer. So thank you all for taking time to answer. High-level agenda for the day. Welcome and introductions. That's kind of what we're doing now. I mentioned earlier, Molly is really sick and couldn't make it today, so it's just me as a host. Let's jump in. Thank you again for being here. This week's question was really about these two sort of very high-level approaches to beginning a system. And so I realize, of course, there's so much more nuance to this than just inside out or outside in. And what I learned in looking at all of your responses is that you all get that. I think there were a lot of folks who struggled with the answer because in writing out their answer to one or the other, they realized, oh my goodness, maybe it's the other thing for me, or maybe it's some hybrid of these two. But you played along well, you chose sides. And so that was a lot of fun for me to read through. And so if you'll recall what we did, but you basically were asked to choose inside out, outside in, or other, and then asked for a little bit more detail on that. So I've got a bunch of data to share with you, but I've kind of got it hidden at the moment. So what I would love to do to start with is for you all just to grab a sticky note and put it on here on this thing, where the heck you chose to participate. And if you've changed your mind, that's totally okay. You can change your mind. Lots of room for us to grow. And we're going to see quickly all the inside out folks getting on there right away. That's awesome. Now, I know there's a few of you others too, so don't be nervous. Just jump right in. While you're doing that, I'll just say too, feel free to unmute and chime in. This is supposed to be kind of a collaborative opportunity to learn. So, okay, this is fantastic. And this actually kind of accurately represents sort of what we saw. So if you haven't done that yet, feel free to go ahead and put your sticky where you landed. What I'm going to do now is just kind of quickly share with you what I sort of learned. So we sent this out to 140 people. And we got about 50 responses. So statistically, what we saw was about 70%, 65% or so chose inside out. Although I can tell from the answers that it was a struggle to choose. 22% chose outside in, and then 5 of you were brave and chose other. And so in reading through the answers, it was really fascinating. I'm sharing the raw data with you too. So it's a little bit hard to see, but this little link right here, see the raw data, will actually take you to an anonymized spreadsheet that just has all of the answers in there. So you can take some time to read through all of that on your own. But it'll be really fun for you to read some of the answers. I went and chose a few of my favorites right here. This is a trick question, isn't it? Was my favorite comment, I think, in the whole thing. But lots of very strong opinions. And it's interesting that the 6-month timeline that I gave sort of in the hypothetical scenario really impacted answers. I think a lot of you who chose outside in said, because of the tight timeline to show value, I felt like I needed to start by showing components like something from the outside in, because that's what my consumers would need, right? So that was really interesting to hear that like the timeline actually makes an impact on how we would think about the answer to this. Most of the other folks were saying, hey, it's got to be a combination of these things, And so I think a lot of people expressed that in their answers, no matter what side they chose. I ended up noticing that there were lots of folks who were explaining why, giving the pros and cons. So I tried to kind of call out some of these. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you chose inside out, if you chose outside in, take a look at the pros and cons and see, like, are these the things that kind of helped you to choose that? And jump in and share sort of what you are observing here from some of these answers. In general, the advantages here in the outside in approach were a lot around like the perceived success of the system. So a lot of folks said things like, it's more immediate, the impact. It's easier to tie roadmaps, ROIs, OKRs. The prioritization is easier, because I can just go talk to folks and understand what they need. Are these things that aligned with those of you who chose this outside in?
Yeah, we're actually right in the middle of that at the New York State. And it's interesting because we are struggling with this philosophical debate. So I feel a little opinionated just because because of the variety of platforms, it's going to be really difficult to, our foundations will be so granular that it almost doesn't carry a lot of value, and the needs are really on identifying, what are our common patterns? How do we provide them in a way that's actually going to support people who maybe aren't, really, who don't know design system work, right? And who don't understand that. So I've for us, really starting from the outside in helped us kind of do some of that inventory work, but start a little more broadly. So
other thoughts there?
I think a lot of these advantages and disadvantages are really interesting. I chose inside out, mostly because it's how we're getting the design work actually done. But looking at what you've captured, people saying the advantages of outside in it's a reason why we end up taking both strategies. Like from the design standpoint, we're often just hiding the complexity from our stakeholder and just saying, well, in order to get this header done, we do have to really do inside out with our tokens, with our buttons to create this header. So we end up presenting to other stakeholders and other groups for adoption as outside in, but the work and how we actually get it done from a design standpoint, and the sticky that says it's irresponsible to define a type scale without considering how it would present. That one really resonates with me because that's kind of how we feel on the design side, but that's very hard to communicate to stakeholders. So we end up executing inside out, but making it look like we're doing outside in. So people who don't really understand the work can resonate with it a bit more.
That's awesome. I love that sort of, what are the optics of how the work is happening? That's really fascinating. Amy, what's up?
I think that was, so I was the one that responded that you have to get people feeling like there's a need. And if the outside in sort of like is more impactful in your storytelling, I would definitely, focus on that, because that's what sort of like gets the attention and gets, people thinking that like the design system is going to make a change. Because often you try to start doing the tokens and the foundations, and it takes a while for that to surface, right? Like you're going to do your audits, you're going to put together your style guides or whatever you need. And it may be, a month and a half before something truly ships. And so there's this like lag. And so when you can show outside in, and if your leaders really gravitate towards that, they're saying, oh, wow, design system came in, here's a new pattern. They can visualize that. They can't visualize, oh, all these buttons are going to change, but they can see the whole composition.
Yeah, I love that. Ness, what's on your mind?
I guess I wanted to sort of cover something that was like probably not necessarily from this foundation of like creating something from scratch, but something that I really learned from creating a system from scratch and then moving to doing an entire rebrand at Wise was when we built the system from scratch, my last company, it was very much like okay, do we do foundations? Do we do components? We ended up doing a lot of things in parallel. And as a result, we had to rework a lot of stuff because foundations don't really work at scale when you don't know what you're building for. But I actually this is why I'm on the sort of between the other and inside out, because at Wise, we actually really focused on foundations, and we realized that actually having the outside in approach or having components first was actually a hindrance to our system, because we hadn't really thought about the problems about typography at scale within our product. We didn't really think about the problems of color and how they scaled. And as a result of like taking a step back and actually looking at our entire product and finding what those problems are, like hierarchy with typography, semantic naming with typography, how designers and engineers were using them, by defining what those foundations were, we then remapped all of our components to work with them. So I guess my opinion with that is if you take the outside in approach, you're going to have to rework a lot of stuff anyway. So it's going to be a lot of work either way. But I think the foundational approach is almost kind of the stronger one, because you're fixing a lot of product problems from the inside out effectively. But that's obviously having a longer timeline within a short time frame. It's going to make more sense to work outside in.
That's great. I think that the observation that it's almost like without one, you can't do the other. I think it was you maybe that said chicken and an egg, right? Like this is the challenge. How do you choose, right? Eric, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what people are saying here. And I think one of the things that I've always found in trying to build a system for bringing a whole bunch of products together, or even starting from the scratch, is also the engineering perspective is, it's a really great way to start building, if you don't already have it, that relationship between design and development. And starting with foundations is some great small wins to, start building a communication. It's like, hey, if we can all just agree on a color set and implement color set and nothing else, that's the start of a system. You started the relationship, you've started developing a language. And then, it gets only easier the more complex you try and build onto that. I read something or heard something recently from Dan Mall, who was like, hey, the best place actually to start is with your most complicated component. And I'm trying to wrap my head around that idea. But it's still like what I think was Ness said, like, if you start there, you still have to come back and redo everything that's underneath it. So starting with, your type, your icons, and your color, if you can get that done and nothing else, then you've got at least some thread, some through line of all your products that you can then build on.
I think this comment, I don't recall who it was, but I actually love to refactor, tidy, and simplify code. I think that is something that I resonated with too. And that's, I think, on the outside in approach, where it's like, hey, let's solve for the experience of the customer. And then let's do that a few times. And then let's refactor those great experiences into the necessary foundational pieces to use that great work across other experiences, So like that starting broad and refactoring down, the outside in risks are worrisome to me though, like this idea of like, it doesn't scale if I don't have the foundations established. Has anybody struggled with that particular struggle, and that forced you to choose inside out?
Yeah, we had to do outside in because of the stakeholders. I think in parallel, we were trying to do inside in secret, try to establish our own things while we were at the same time creating complex components like models and other components. We're still suffering for that depth that we created, and still trying to refactor some of them. And I think sometimes you just have to do whatever stakeholders, because they're stakeholders. And sometimes if you just put a good argument, and it's a very good argument, and you give all the reasons, and they still say to you, you have to start the house by the roof. You're like, okay, I will start the house by the roof. But I'm gonna see if every now and then I can do a little bit of the basement and the foundations. So whenever I have to do the foundations, then at least it's a little bit done. I actually found that a good way of showing progress when you're doing inside out is to bake in accessibility into it. If you do a color palette and you show what colors have to work with what colors, and you put the levels into what's going to be contrast compliance, all that shows progress for stakeholders. It's not just pretty colors together that designers do. That's basically something that is easier to see the value into, and things like that, especially if you do an audit with loads of buttons inconsistent into the product, and then you just do like, and we have this button that is accessible and is going to fix all of this, then that's another way of showing value. So if your stakeholders can't see the value on doing inside out, try to think about the money and how to show that this is, making this, and if you're very good at all of this, thinking about the return of investment of things, and, how can we quantify the design system? How can we show progress to stakeholders, etc. I could be talking for 30 minutes, so I'll stop now.
Yeah, that's great. Jeremy in the chat said, sell outside in while building inside out. I think that's great. That kind of gets back to that initial idea of optics. That's great. Daniel, what's going on?
Hi. One of the interesting risks that I don't think has been put out for outside in is picking the right team. We've made this mistake twice trying to do outside in. First time we worked on a security flow where the components that we were making weren't very useful for anybody else in the organization. And so that to start was not very, scalable. The second mistake we did making outside in was then trying to make components for the most important project in the company. And then when as you're starting up a design system, there's still so much infrastructure, process, and things that goes on behind the scenes that you have to get right. If you're trying to do that and be, say we know what we're doing on the most important project, it's great if it works out, but the pressures on the team are immense. And so picking a stable team that isn't super high quality, kind of middle, provides that flexibility to give you that time to make mistakes and have some components that be more useful to everybody later on.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I've always had this philosophy that for the system to be perceived as valuable, you have to get close to the money. Like where is the part of the business that's generating revenue? And I think of it as influence, but usually that means money. So that I don't know how that aligns up with what you're saying, where it's like choose a team that's sort of middle of the road, stable, but maybe not high priority. Like I understand the challenge that led you to that, but I'm also trying to figure out how that aligns with other things that have worked, So I don't know if you have a thought there, but
yeah, I found that the best teams to work with are like onboarding teams where they're having the registration flows, what's your personal details. That stuff's quite stable. You need that to make the money in the first place. And we find that at least in the CVS, forms are one of the things we do a lot of. Yeah. And so we know that's scalable across the organization.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jesse, what's up?
It's interesting. This reminds me a little bit of the difficulty I had when responsive web design came around, because people had a hard time, clients that I would work with had a hard time imagining the responsive states of things. They wanted to be able to picture them at various snapshots, right? And I think it comes back to the lack of context. And I think that's why it's harder for stakeholders to understand foundations, because they don't understand the context in which they're used. I think design system teams and product teams do understand that context. And so I think the conversation, the kind of back channel that has been going on has been this idea of, I think part of the reason why I said starting with outside in is because it grounds you in the finished product. It provides that necessary context, but you inevitably, and I think pretty quickly, have to pivot to those foundations. But having that view of this is what we're specifically focusing on also helps focus the foundations work to because foundations work can be pretty varied too. You can have padding, you can have grid work, you can have typography. So it can be very wide and varied as well. So starting, I guess partly why I thought the outside in approach is because it grounds that. And then you as your team can kind of say, here are the things we need to prioritize from the inside out. And then you can start to demonstrate the value of that foundation work in the context of the larger kind of product experience for the end user.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, Jesse. Thanks for articulating that. Michael, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I was going to say, Jesse, it's a great point. Foundations take a long time, I think, to get right. And to me, I wrote the comment that, within the 6 months is what I really focused on, is how do you show value in 6 months? Because it's really not a lot of time. And if you're able to partner with the team, ideally, and contribute to their work, that's how I saw outside in, by the way. If you can contribute to their work and get some feedback from the group, whether it's quotes or it's actually moving the needle on improving their velocity as evidence for your stakeholders to say, we've created this common component. It makes the team more efficient so they could focus on other things. I think you're going to have a better story to tell in 6 months versus ideally it'd be great to start with foundations if you didn't have any pressure. It makes scaling as a systems designer to create components a lot easier. But if you have 6 months, it might take 6 months to create those foundations and to get agreement from a lot of people, and not to mention all of that integration work, that UX debt work or UI debt or however you want to call it. That's a lot of work too, and that takes a lot of convincing that it's worth that. And if I were to choose, it's really the 6 months, and that's the way I saw this prompt.
Yeah, I'll have to make sure I keep that in mind when I give you a fake context next time. Hey everybody, there's still a lot of great content left in this episode, but let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors.
How much time are you spending wrangling all the aspects of your design system? Trying to create a unified experience with your UI libraries, your code resources, your design tokens? You need a platform that makes managing a design system easier, not a chore. So zeroheight is the design system management platform that centralizes everything, including your documentation. And this year, we've rolled out some game-changing features that make zeroheight even more powerful. First up, we have the adoption tab, which gives you real-time insights into how your design system is actually being used. So you can hook it up directly to your code repos and NPM packages, and it will not only make sure that everyone is using your latest packages, but it'll also give you insights into component usage as well. Finally, you can prove real design system ROI. And then there's our brand new API as well. In a few minutes, you can create your own Figma plugin or API chatbot to bring your documentation to the places that your team is actually searching for it. If you're looking to make design system management seamless and efficient, what are you waiting for? Try zeroheight for free today by heading to zeroheight.com and use the offer code QUESTION to get a free 90-day trial. That's zeroheight.com and the offer code is QUESTION. Enjoy the show.
For the last 16 years, Ben and I have both been business partners and friends in our company Sparkbox, which is always aimed to build a better web. In the beginning, that was two software engineers coming together believing there was a better way to do things. What Sparkbox evolved into is a complete team that includes user experience, design, engineering, and plenty of consulting and strategy. About 10 years ago, we dove headfirst into design systems, helping some of the world's largest companies and universities and even tons of small businesses to help realize the efficiency and promise of what design systems can bring. I continue to be in awe of what Ben learns and shares in this community. If you need strategic or tactical help with your design system, swing by sparkbox.com and reach out. We'd love to partner with you and your team. Have a great day. Enjoy the show.
It actually aligns a little bit with something I was thinking about. If you go to the bottom right over on the notes and questions side, the bottom left, I've always thought about systems in this way, where it's like the brand feeds into the system enables digital experiences, the digital experiences are what allow you to connect with your audience, right? So the goal of every company is to get their brand connected to an audience. But I realized through all of this that the brand is actually a lot more than just the noun of the identity, the mission, the values, right? It's the emotional connection the audience has to the organization that your customers have with you. And so in a way, this is just a big loop, which makes me think about the inside out very differently. It's kind of like without this emotional connection, this is an inside out approach. We start with the brand. We operationalize that in some way with tokens, with core systems, with components, with patterns, and that helps us connect to our audience. But really, it all comes back because the way that they interact and feel about you is also critical. And so in a way, this to me made it feel like this isn't a linear process, right? It's a cyclical process. And we're going to spin around on this loop until we get things right. And that means outside in is part of the process, inside out is part of the process. I know folks have to roll. That's totally okay. Thank you for being here if you have to. But we'll make sure we release the recording for you too. Kevin, what's on your mind?
This is such a great conversation, and it really gets into the heart of design systems, and so many dynamics are in play. For instance, one interesting dynamic I was noticing is that if we need to present to stakeholders, we need to show top down. We can't go inside out, and yet. And that is business, and honestly, we're doing design systems. We're not doing it on our own. We're going to be doing it for a big business. So that's an important dynamic. Yet, if we ignore, or rather start building from the top, the roof, as someone had mentioned, without the basement, understanding your primitive tokens, how are you going to do your palette colors, your contextual colors, your typography, and all that, then you're only really inviting another year or two before you have to redo it. And oh my God, it's only going to be harder. Let's say that we're design system professionals. What is the most professional way to do it?
That's interesting. So if we take the business out of it and just think about, what I've heard from folks is inside out is the way we should do it. Would people agree with that? I don't know. I'm an outside in person, I think, because I don't think you can decide all of the things you need, the foundations, until you have context within which to operate it. So,
and that's a great point. And that's a great point, because what is the context? Are you doing a multi-brand? Do those brands have sub themes within those things? Let's say, I'm at Dow Jones, we've got Wall Street Journal, we've got like Opinion, we've got Magazine, we've got what have you. Or are you doing it for IBM and IBM only? Now you have a completely different approach.
Mm-hmm. What's everybody else think about this? Jump in.
Yeah, I think so much of it has to do, obviously, with the scale of the product you're inheriting, the amount of debt that exists. Currently, really, I think has a big impact on kind of the approach in some ways. But regardless, I still really strongly feel like inside out, like if we can approach it that way, it's ideal. I think the reality is they're going to happen at the same time to some degree. I don't think you can feasibly live in a silo while the product stops and just focus on foundations and tokens. The reality is, while you're focusing on that, there's going to be new features, there's going to be new aspects of the business and new patterns that are getting built. And while that's happening, I think, you can focus on the foundations and build almost an inventory of all of these things that are happening, start applying foundations to those pieces, and you're kind of doing both at once, I think, to some degree. And I don't think there's a way around that. But the foundational bits are so critical to get everyone on the team aligned, I think, from design to engineering, and build a culture that thinks system first, requires those foundational pieces to be in place. And if you don't have that culture, I don't think you can move to the place where you can really build these complex, scalable patterns with success long term.
Yeah, that's good, Chris. Christy, what are you thinking?
I agree. I think it ends up being both at the same time. It's almost impossible to get stakeholder buy-in on typography. Your CEO just does not care. So I do think it has to be, for me, I've just kind of banded them together, kind of like Congress does with new bills. I'm like, oh, if you want this new journey, you're going to have to redo your titles. So that's how I sell the foundations. It's like making sure that they're combined together with new journeys and new business objectives. But yeah, I really, coming from a place where I've had to negotiate with marketing on colors on the website because they just don't make sense, print versus, your website and being accessible. That can be a really difficult conversation. It takes a lot of time to get that buy-in from the other departments to make sure that you're going to be successful. You're not going to have someone just come in and scrape it. So it's hard. I think as I look at this little map you've got here, I actually see it not as a big loop, but as each little step looping back on itself. Because as you kind of take your brand and then you expand it to work digitally, and that's kind of where you get your foundations in your design system. But then your digital experience will also fold back into your brand and your digital experiences and vice versa.
Yeah.
I think in an ideal world, we would come in and we'd create our taxonomy maps and we'd have all our design system tokens right off the bat, but that's kind of not possible because as your business grows and as your discovery and your research grows, you're going to find that you were wrong and your assumptions are wrong. You have to rebuild it anyways. So
yeah, that's true. That's true. Jesse, what's up?
Not to get too abstract, but I was reading a book about the history of big scientific ideas, and it was really interesting because they were talking about the pivot between like the discovery of the atom, and then how there kind of went from atoms to more the relationship between atoms, and it was really interesting because one of the key things that the book talked about was how that even though parts in a system seem analogous to the same parts in another system, they need to be analyzed in relationship to the way that they fit within the whole. And so in order to understand the system, you need to understand the functions of the whole. And so it's interesting because I feel like a lot of foundations is about atoms, right? It's about getting all those individual parts right. And I think that is, you can't get around it. I think it's important. You have to be able to understand those foundational pieces in order to understand how they relate to one another. But it's the relationship and and the fact that they don't necessarily have the same properties as the system it does. Yeah. Because the way that those individual parts relate to each other, and I don't know, this feels like there's a bigger point there, but really thinking about the grounding of the why we need these, it's easier to make that case, up the chain, and so yeah, just, again, something I'm
Jesse, about. I think we may have been reading some similar things because I was studying the same concept around analysis versus synthesis, where it's like, if I'm going to take something apart, I can understand what it is, but it doesn't help me understand why it is what it is, right? You take a car apart, you don't understand like why they drive on the right side of the road versus the left side of the road in whatever country you took it apart in, but you understand how the steering column works. But if you want to understand why, you have to look outside of the system. And that's where I think the outside-in approach is really valuable, because I think culturally, my values align more with that. Like, let's understand why we're doing this before we try to analyze it, and that's
right. And because there's assumptions, I think that get baked into those foundations, right? Yes. Because we can say more broadly atomic decisions that are foundationalized, but a lot of that is going to come down to, well, how granular do these tokens need to be, for example? Mm-hmm. Like, how many t-shirt sizes are we going to go here, right? Like, you start to like make those decisions, and those small decisions, I think, ultimately end up being informed by the how they get used. So I'm not saying that foundations aren't important. I'm just saying like they get more helpful context when you start to evaluate like where will these things be used. And so I bet you the inside out folks are considering the outside in perspective as they're making those decisions anyway, you know?
Yeah. What's up, Ron?
I just wanted to call out maybe a couple of possibly unstated assumptions that would modulate the approach fairly significantly. Number one is the system that we're building primarily a visual design only thing without much of a code element, or is code intricately involved, or is it even a code first endeavor? Like that's point number one. Point number two is one distinction you've made in other forums. Is it a top-down organizational initiative, or is it a bottom-up organic one that we need to promote and rally people to? And so I think both of those would have an impact on whether the work that your design system team is trying to do, are you trying to rationalize and systematize what already exists without fundamentally pushing the needle, but you're just trying to optimize and make efficiencies and power up the teams that are building this stuff? Or are you actually trying to make a step change in what you're aiming to? So this comes back to your diagram about which loops back the audience to the brand. And just, it's not the same example, but specific example from my current context. We've got an existing brand. It's really well known. It's not just a digital brand. We've got physical, real world products. We've got stores. So the brand is a big thing. We needed a digital expression of the brand, which is, more refined, meets all the accessibility criteria, still looks updated and fresh, but is recognizable and tied back to the overall brand. And this didn't exist. There's all the different platforms and portals, whether it's the marketing site or logged in states or native apps. They all look different in various stages in the company's history and design iterations that they've gone through and what's been prioritized, what hasn't. So it's a big milieu. And we've inherited a system which has certain of those design decisions baked in, and foundational elements are built in, capturing a point in time, but it's not one that we want to be wedded to. So we partnered with the brand team and their external agency to do outside in, but not just at the level of, a particular journey or a large set of components, but the whole digital expression of the brands. Like, we're not just kind of being archaeologists or archivists for what exists and rationalizing. We're reimagining what we want the website to look like before even rebuilding or redefining the values that go into the foundational tokens and that sort of thing. So it's outside in, but from a more exploratory perspective that we then descend through back down to the inside out to achieve. So getting that multi-scalar approach, but starting from outside, but not just outside as in a component or a flow or a user journey, but the whole visual expression of the digital brand.
I have one last little exercise I would love for us to do, which is to go back to the choose a side board. And if your mind has been swayed and you want to move your sticky, now's your chance to do it. It's okay if it hasn't been, but I'm just curious to see if anybody is sort of like having second thoughts. Okay, not really. One other thought that I had as I was thinking through this is in the bottom right over on that notes section, I kind of sketched out sort of my thinking around what a system is, which is like these foundations, layers, tokens, layers, things kind of moving out to core systems, to components and patterns. And I realized that some of the answers had this idea of a sort of like a fundamental set of layers that give you just sort of some primal consistency, right? So I kind of sketched that out as like these inner three layers, the fundamental ones, like foundations, tokens, core systems. beyond that is where we switch our conversation from consistency to cohesion, right? It's about the experience of our users with our products. And that's where I started thinking, like, when I say outside in, I'm thinking like the reason we're doing this is for the benefit of our users too, right? We want that experience to be cohesive for them across products, perhaps across brands. But we can't really build cohesive experiences if we don't have consistent foundational pieces to build them with. So this is where I think it gets at that sort of like it's both in some ways, you know. So that was just another visual that kind of, I'm a pretty visual thinker. I have to draw things in order to understand them. So that was something that was helpful for me. Any other final thoughts on this? Some of you haven't had a chance to speak up, so let me know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'm curious. One of the things that we haven't keyed in on is how many people you have allocated initially. And I'm curious if that would change any of the focus, where if you had a team of 5 versus 2 to 3, would you do both? Would you say we have more runway and more people to focus on these aspects versus another? And how much does team size play into that?
Yeah, Jeremy, that's a great question. In fact, I don't remember who it was. So if you're on the call, jump in. But somebody said, if I had more people, here's how I would do it. And they kind of laid out an actual strategy where it's like 2 people would be focused on these things and 2 people would be doing this. So they were definitely thinking, let's take it both ways because we have resources to do so. Anyone else? Yeah, what's up, Eppo?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything totally new to add, but I think you need both, but it's about your focus that you have to likely do some inventory and you likely have to envision somehow how you would like all those views look like in the future. But still you can either focus on nailing down those views and focus on them, or use them as a basis and help for you to define the insights. And then maybe eventually when you are actually building those views, they won't end up being anything like you first drafted them. I think that's very close to my experience also.
Yeah. It's funny because I think it's probably possible to be successful anyway here, right? But the culture within which you're trying to do this probably dictates the approach you have to take. Somebody earlier said, your CEO doesn't care about the type. I think it was you, Christy, maybe, but somebody does. But it's like, well, maybe your CEO was a typographer back in their younger days, and they do care about the type, you know. So maybe you could actually get them to buy into a more foundational first approach. So I think that's another thing to think about. One of the exercises I try to go through in my systems work is I actually try to understand every leader's what is it that every leader values at a very high level. Like, what are their goals? Because design systems are wildly capable of showing value in lots and lots of different ways. I think we really limit what we think. We say consistency and efficiency, but it's like, man, there's so much more they can do. And so if I learn that a leader is all about sustainability, they want us to write greener code or design greener products that have an impact on the planet. Well, a design system can help with that, right? Like if we put really good green design practices, green coding practices, and embed those into the system, we can spread that sustainable approach to product around the organization much faster. So it's like understanding the needs or the value, that the goals of every individual leader shapes the stories that we use to sort of tell about the system inside the organization. And that's something that I've learned. It requires that level of understanding every individual's what they value. Jesse, jump in.
I'm just going to say, I think it was yesterday on LinkedIn, Erica Hall actually posted something similar where she basically said the first thing you need to do is diagram the business model of the organization that you're working on behalf of. Because you need to understand what the motivation is behind the value. Because even if you're doing foundations work, at some point you have to decide, like, how much are we going to do? Like at Config, I saw Ford Motor Company team has an amazing foundation setup. I mean, amazing. But they're supporting, applications, CarPlay. They've got a ton of different products that they're supporting. So in that case, there's tremendous value for something like that for them. So anyway, just echoing your point.
Yeah, that's great. Jeremy, what's up?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I view design systems where I always have to defend the work. And so I tend to view this as well as if I had no budget, which approach would I take? And I think that I would probably still do outside in because I can at least demonstrate some value and care for a larger effort. Where if it was the opposite and somebody's like, what, you just been messing with colors and buttons all day? Like I have a harder time defending that type of work versus at least I tried to solve a business problem. So I still like the outside in, but having those foundational pieces in the back pocket to work with to support those. So
Amy, what's going on?
Going back to the defending your design system. I think that if you're kind of in the position of defending your design system, you need to kind of walk that organizational ladder and figure out who in the leadership is your fan, because it's really, really hard to do it alone. But when you have leadership support and they help speak for you, it helps sort of like give you a voice at the table that you're not invited to.
Yeah, Amy, that is so critical. And it's incredibly frustrating when you don't have that. I've even seen scenarios where the leadership is actively against the system, not just a non-participant, but literally trying to prevent it from happening. And that's really frustrating. Of course, if you can turn that person, now that's like a double win, right? Because they stop trying to be destructive and they also begin helping. So that's tough. Jesse or Amy, go ahead. Sorry if you want to respond.
Sorry, I just want to, you said like if the leadership is actively against you, I think you have to start to ask yourself, is that the right organization for me? Because like if you are trying to make something happen and it is not aligning to the current business, that is going to be a struggle, no matter who you convince.
Yeah, no, that's great. Jesse?
I would be really curious to know who has an engineering background, because I wonder if that feeds into this. Because if you've ever done engineering work before, you have to deal with these questions all the time, things that stakeholders in general don't care about. Do I use TypeScript? Don't I? How do I structure my variables? You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of those things. And so I used to coach like junior engineers. And one of the things that I always say is like, when it comes to talking up the ladder, brevity is a superpower, right? Like make sure these decisions matter, but in the scope of the engineering work. And so there's like good engineering practices that a lot of stakeholders, especially on the engineering side, really don't understand. And you just know, like, if I don't build it this way, it's going to be really hard for us to expand the functionality. When they come back to me and they say, we want to change this, I built it the right way. You know what I mean? And so I think maybe from an engineering perspective, it feels almost like more like a given, like, well, we're building it, yes, with those foundations in place anyway.
If you're willing to share, you can edit your sticky note over on the left side and just put what your background is: design, engineering, product, whatever it might be. That way we could kind of see if there's a little correlation there. Good call, Jesse.
As sort of being a leader in product and working directly with engineering, I actually think you don't need executive buy-in as long as you have engineering buy-in. Because you can just do it by adding it to stories, and as long as you both agree to do it, you do it. So that's been my secret sauce, or secret to my sauce, I don't know, for success in design systems.
That's fascinating. I think that works probably until you have to, once the system is adopted and all over the place, supporting it becomes a massive task, and it's like, if there's not support at the leadership level to fund a team to actually continue to support it, that's really hard. Ness?
I think there's something to be said about like just going rogue though. Like I've seen this happen before. I've been in this position before where I decided we needed a design system and was able to quickly just spin it up with another engineer that I had support from. But what we built wasn't the right thing for the org. And as a result, like this was very, very early on in my career where I learned a lot of hard lessons. And at my previous org, where we built a design for system from scratch, we did a lot of other things to mitigate those risks, and obviously deciding like, were we going to use a framework? Were we going to, what governance model were we going to use? Like, what problems were we trying to solve? Almost all of that stuff around like aligning with the leadership and knowing what they wanted as well. And that helped us a lot in terms of getting buy-in. And we still had to sort of like, we did get buy-in from a lower level and ended up just having a small team and doing it. But as a result of doing all of that work, we actually saved ourselves from a lot of stress, because we knew that we were going to move from a branded system to a white label system. So we were able to build the infrastructure to then support that early on, which saved us a lot of stress in the long term and actually gave us additional buy-in on the way. So I guess my only concern is like, if you just jump in and you have buy-in from like lower level or engineering, like if you're not doing that work as well, you run the risk of having to redo quite a bit of stuff and in the process.
Okay, I'm going to call it, y'all. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for just jumping in. I wish Molly could have been here. She couldn't, but we'll get her back another week. And then if you know of folks who are interested in sponsoring something like this, just to cover costs of all the tools that we're using to make it work, that would be fantastic. Perhaps, your company's hiring on the design systems team. This might be a great thing to do 1 week or so. You all are the best. Thank you so much for being willing to jump in. Great to see you all. All right, everybody, that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much to Zeroheight and to Sparkbox for making it possible. And of course, thanks to all of you for staying in learning mode. I'll see you next week.